Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and today we're going to do something a little different. While I like to think I have pretty eclectic taste when it comes to music, my preferred genres are in the classical and rock genres. And in particular, my favorite band of all time, bar none, is Blue Oyster Cult.
Yes, the song you're thinking of is exactly what caused this band to blip on my radar in the first place. But as I looked deeper into things, as I am often wont to do, I discovered that the band had a whole boatload of great material beyond that one and the other two that comprise the only 3 songs the radio ever plays.
In fact, BOC was quite influential for a band considered obscure.
They were the first band to use a gratuitous umlaut in their name, and the first band to make use of lasers during their live shows. Their unusual lyrical content, supported by surprisingly versatile music, led to them earning a reputation as the thinking man's heavy metal band, a reputation they more than live up to, and which no doubt influenced many bands which followed them. However, thanks in large part to the band members living stable lives and avoiding the kinds of pitfalls which artists can succumb to, they never gained enough controversy to make headlines outside of their music, hence why we never got a Behind the Music episode on their exploits.
This is a band that deserves far more recognition than it gets. And while it's possible Razorfist may do a Metal Mythos episode on them one day, I've decided I don't want to wait that long. I've got every single studio album they produced, more time on my hands than a person should have, and a lot of research under my belt, so I'm going to take up the cause. Raise your can of beer on high. This is the complete Blue Oyster Cult album retrospective.
The story of Blue Oyster Cult begins with music producer Sandy Pearlman. As a college student, he had written a series of narrative poems which he called The Soft Doctrines of Imaginos. This lyrical series was a fusion of real-world history and Lovecraftian horror focused on a figure named, well, Imaginos, a human-alien hybrid who secretly influenced human affairs on behalf of the godlike aliens Les Invisibles, who were worshipped on Earth by the Blue Oyster Cult.
Once he became a music producer, Pearlman set about the task of gathering the best musicians he could find to form a group that could adapt the soft doctrines of Imaginos to song.
After a couple of false starts with Soft White Underbelly and Stock Forest Group, Blue Oyster Cult would eventually materialize. Comprised of frontman and stun guitarist Eric Bloom, lead guitarist Donald Buck Dharma Roser, bassist Joe Bouchard, drummer Albert Bouchard, and keyboardist Alan Lehner.
Lest you get it in your head that this band was a soulless studio concoction, you should know that none of the Oyster Boys are to be underestimated. They were each skilled musicians capable of playing multiple instruments and writing their own material.
As such, it was decided that the band would function democratically, with each member getting a chance to contribute music and lyrics for each album, and even taking turns on lead vocals.
This would give the band a very eclectic sound, and nowhere is that more evident than on their debut album. When Blue Oyster Cult's self-titled 1972 debut album was being recorded, nobody really knew what the defining sound of the group would be. As such, there's a lot of experimentation on this album, running the gamut from soft rock to psychedelic rock to, I kid you not, country rock.
Make no mistake though, it was the hard and heavy stuff that would stand out to most listeners, particularly Cities on Flame with Rock and Roll and Stairway to the Stars. However, if I were to point to the song that best exemplifies what Blue Oyster Cult would eventually become known for, it would be the 9th track, Workshop of the Telescopes. This track, for which every band member and Pearlman receive writing credits, was our first glimpse into the Imaginos storyline, and set the tone for what would become the band's bread and butter. Complex musical composition with unusual lyrics too specific to be word salad, yet too strange to be tuned out while driving. You have to listen to what's being sung because your curiosity compels you to know what it's about, and even then, it's open to interpretation. Such lyrics would become a defining feature which made the band distinct. They weren't just making silly love songs, they were telling stories and presenting them in ways you actually had to listen to.
This first album wasn't a runaway success, but it did well enough that a second album was drafted, and it would become significant for reasons that extend beyond the band itself. band that puts out a great first album runs the risk of falling into the sophomore slump when they make their second album. But a band with an okay first album can potentially make improvements for a great second album if they're smart. Naturally, the minds behind Blue Oyster Cult were very smart, and that led to 1973's Tyranny and Mutation.
For this album, the band took notes on what worked best the first time and embraced those aspects. Gone are the psychedelic overtures and country road detours, replaced with good old-fashioned rock and roll.
This is best exemplified by the album's opening track, The Red and the Black, which was a reimagining of the first album's song, I'm on the Lamb but I Ain't No Sheep. The lyrics are the same, but the music here is harder and less twangy, which makes it sound much better. It's got more of an edge to it, but in a good way.
It's alright.
The trend of enigmatic lyricism also continues with songs like Wings Wetted Down and Seven Screaming Dizbusters, accompanied by a few straightforward yet unconventional numbers like OD'd on Life Itself.
The album is also significant to the music world on a much grander scale.
At the time, Alan Lehner was dating a young woman who was also attempting to break into popular music, mostly by way of playing nightclubs. She had a knack for writing lyrics that fit the cult style, so she contributed to Tyranny and Mutation.
As a result, the album's B-side opens with Baby Ice Dog, the first professionally recorded song to be penned by Patti Smith.
Yes, that Patti Smith, the punk rocker who wrote Horses and The People Have the Power. She and Lehner were an item for the first few years of BOC's career, which allowed her to contribute lyrics to the band and prove her mettle until she got her own solo career. So to any Patti Smith fans out there watching this video, on behalf of the band, you're welcome.
This second album was moderately successful. It was more of an underground hit than a mainstream hit, and the band was quite comfortable existing in this realm, so they would stay there for their third album. Rounding out what many call the band's black and white period is Secret Treaties, which was almost a Soft Doctrines of Imaginos concept album. The main reason it's not is because drummer Albert Bouchard was the only one who actually wanted to do an Imaginos concept album, and due to the democratic nature of how the band was run, he was outvoted.
There are a few traces left over from that original plan on the finished album, including 2 adapted songs, Subhuman and Astronomy, and a little text blurb on the liner notes containing a typo which has never been corrected. Of the 2 aforementioned songs, Astronomy is the superior number, with its ethereal atmosphere, expert tempo changes, and willingness to play with the stereo format, not to mention the lyrics are easier to hear over the music than in Subhuman.
Unfortunately, this album would also indirectly help promote a rumor which had been following the band around from the start. You see, there had always been a suspicion that Blue Oyster Cult was kind of a neo-Nazi band. Yes, people thought heavy metal had a neo-Nazi problem even back then.
At first, the rumors were sparked by the band's association with Hell's Angels and other biker groups, as well as their unusual logo that people thought looked kind of like a swastika. It's actually an alchemical symbol for Kronos, but in all fairness, you can't blame the average person for not knowing that. Suspicions grew when the band played up the red and black color scheme on their second album, which many associated with Nazi symbolism. This of course ignored how the song The Red and the Black was actually about fleeing from the Canadian Mounties, which are mentioned by name.
But Secret Treaties is what finally sent people over the edge.
Here on the album cover was a drawing of the band posing with 2 German shepherds in front of a Messerschmitt 262 fighter jet, representing the album song ME-262, told from the perspective of a German fighter pilot during World War II. For many, this was the proof that Blue Oyster Cult was Nazi rock.
The rumor, unfortunately, never went away, so allow me to properly dispel it for you here and now. Blue Oyster Cult is not a Nazi band!
For starters, Eric Bloom and Sandy Pearlman are Jewish, so go ahead and try reconciling that with the accusations. As for the song ME-262, it's technically not told from the perspective of a Nazi. It's told from the perspective of a German soldier, someone who would have been in the military and thus not a member of the Nazi party. Third, writing the song from the perspective of a German pilot was a purely creative choice, not connected in any way to the band members' political leanings.
It's like writing a crime thriller from the perspective of the criminal. It's not that you condone illegal activity, you're just telling things from a different point of view.
Are there some neo-Nazis who enjoy Blue Oyster Cult? I don't doubt it for a second. Are those neo-Nazi fans representative of the entire fandom or the band itself? Absolutely not, and the same goes for pretty much any other band for which these accusations are leveled. Blue Oyster Cult remained a fairly apolitical band for its entire run, more interested in making good music than making statements, and that's exactly as it ought to be.
Okay, sorry, I got a bit off topic there. Anyway, getting back on track, Secret Treaties is a pretty good album, but it didn't really stand out in any particular way from the last two albums. The most unique thing about it is that it's the only Blue Oyster Cult album where Buck Dharma doesn't sing lead vocals on any of the tracks. But that's okay. He would get his shot next time. Boy, would he get his shot. Up until this point, Blue Oyster Cult was sort of an underground band. They were only successful enough to stay afloat and stay in the studio, but they didn't have a single chart-topping song. You might say, appropriate to the name, they were a cult favorite. That would change drastically with 1976's Agents of Fortune. It was the first Blue Oyster Cult album to go platinum, and it was all thanks to one song. You know the one.
What can be said about Don't Fear the Reaper that hasn't already been said? From its opening notes, you know that you're in for something unique, and the atmosphere is maintained right through to the very end. Of course, this is also one of the most misunderstood songs ever written, given how it was one of the many rock songs of the 70s to be accused of promoting suicide.
This is why you should always listen to the lyrics before stating what you think the song is about.
Don't Fear the Reaper was written at a time when Buck Dharma was afraid he might be dying, and this was his way of coming to terms with it, accepting that death is not necessarily something to fear. On top of that, he added a romantic angle, giving the song a narrative about how love transcends death, a notion which I can't see anyone objecting to.
People got hung up on the suicide angle simply because of one reference to Romeo and Juliet, which is part of the song, but you can't just ignore the rest of the lyrics.
The song speaks at the beginning about how death is just a natural part of life, and the actual narrative is about a couple realizing that separation by death is only temporary. This is all underscored by one of the most iconic guitar riffs ever composed, a melody that's eerie and soothing at the same time. In short, Don't Fear the Reaper is remembered as a masterpiece of classic rock for a reason, and it honestly saddens me that most people these days only associate it with a Saturday Night Live sketch that took one joke that wasn't very funny to begin with and stretched it far longer than it had any right to be.
What about the rest of the album? It's solid from beginning to end.
The second single, ETI Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is equal in compositional quality to Don't Fear the Reaper and contains lyrics that anyone with an interest in ufology will get a kick out of. Songs like Morning Final and The Revenge of Vera Gemini, their pronunciation, have a good atmosphere, and if you prefer the heavier stuff, Tattoo Vampire sure won't disappoint.
This album would also be the only time Alan Lehner would ever take over lead vocal duties, specifically on the second track, True Confessions.
For some reason, Alan never did much singing. He was never credited with vocals on any album other than this one, and he wasn't usually mic'd during live shows. If he wrote a song, he usually passed singing duties off to Eric or Buck, but just this once he decided to sing one of his compositions for himself.
And how does he sound? He sounds alright.
Okay, he didn't have the voice of an angel, but it was fitting for rock and roll, not to mention it adds to the rawness of the song itself.
As stated, Agents of Fortune went platinum and propelled the band into the spotlight. No longer an underground success, now Blue Oyster Cult was a headlining act, and the hits would just keep on coming. Mispronounced as Spectres by some radio DJs of the time, 1977's Spectres gave Blue Oyster Cult their second big hit song, which is also the song that got me into the band in the first place. Look around my backdrop and you can probably guess where this is going.
Do I even need to say that Godzilla is one of my favorite songs ever? The King of the Monsters has always had a musical quality to him, as the sounds of his footsteps and iconic roar were originally created by composer Akira Ifukube with musical instruments. Making a rock and roll song about the G-Man was only natural, and Buck Dharma picked just the right sound for it. The sheer power of those three roaring guitars, thundering drums, and pounding bass just embody Godzilla so perfectly, and the inclusion of Japanese spoken word in the bridge is the perfect touch to make it really stand out. The fact that this is not just a great song, but also a hit that remains a mainstay of classic rock stations to this day, just delights me to no end, as does the fact that it finally got to be featured in 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters. I mean, sure it was a cover, but why split hairs?
Then again, this is about more than just Godzilla. Once again, the album delivers on nearly all fronts.
Godzilla is immediately followed up by the biker epic Golden Age of Leather, then goes into Death Valley Nights, which provides a nice break with some slightly softer music and fascinatingly enigmatic lyrics.
The middle of the album also has some great content, like Are You Ready to Rock and Celestial the Queen, and it ends just as strongly as it begins with a pair of phenomenal vampire-themed songs.
I Love the Night, despite apparently having an entire third verse dropped for some reason, is wonderfully soothing, the kind of thing that can help calm you down at the end of a bad day. Then, of course, the album ends as it begins, with a musical ode to monster movies, this time harkening back to that classic work of shameless plagiarism, Nosferatu. Driven by an eerie piano melody and quotes taken directly from the film, it deserves to stand alongside Godzilla as a rock and roll classic.
In fact, Spectres is the kind of album that can only get better by adding to it.
When the expanded edition was released on CD in 2007, it included 4 bonus tracks cut from the original album. Personally, I feel that Night Flyer and Dial M for Murder are also worth listening to, and it was a shame that they weren't on the original release. The good news is they're available now for you to enjoy, and I don't doubt that you will enjoy them.
The Oyster Boys were on a roll. Agents of Fortune and Spectres both went platinum, as did their live album Some Enchanted Evening. It seemed like nothing could stop them. And then they dropped the ball. It seems like a lot of rock and roll bands from the 70s have that one album they're ashamed of. The one where they tried to go pop, but wound up with a flop. For Blue Oyster Cult, that album is 1978's Mirrors.
Apparently, someone decided that if the band was going to be popular, they had to sound popular, which meant replacing that hard rock tone with the bane of the music world, disco. It's not that the band doesn't still try to maintain its classic sound, but the difference is painfully noticeable. Dance beats, gratuitous percussion instruments, female backup singers in the chorus segments who are clearly just there to generate a disco sound, you name it, the album has it.
The music isn't necessarily bad, mind you, but for the most part it just doesn't sound like Blue Oyster Cult, because it's arguably not.
On top of that, it's obvious that Alan had broken up with Patti Smith by this point. How else do you explain the fact that every single one of his contributions to Mirrors is a mopey number about how lonely he is? Not to sound unsympathetic, I know breakups are hard, but there's only so much wallowing in self-pity that people can take, and in tandem with the ill-advised change in sound, it sticks out in a bad way here.
That's not to say the album is a complete waste of time, mind you. For example, The Vigil is a standout tune.
It comes the closest to sounding what Blue Oyster Cult should sound like, and takes an interesting approach to its subject matter. Like ETI Extraterrestrial Intelligence, it's a song about UFOs and aliens, but rather than describing an otherworldly encounter, it's more about the search for alien life, and the desire of all mankind to find it and know we are really not alone in the universe. I Am the Storm also stands out as the only song present to retain a hard rock sound. Then there's The Great Sun Jester, the beginning of a collaboration for the ages. The song is credited as being written by Eric Bloom and Michael Moorcock.
If you don't know who Michael Moorcock is, then you are sorely missing out. because he is one of the most influential sci-fi and fantasy writers of all time.
Years before steampunk became a subgenre that would spark the birth of a subculture, he wrote the Nomad of the Time Streams trilogy. Years before Game of Thrones brought dark fantasy into the mainstream, he basically invented the genre with Elric of Melniboné and his demon sword Stormbringer. Years before the Marvel Cinematic Universe made shared universes cool, he was tying every single one of his stories together in a sprawling multiverse. He was also no stranger to rock and roll, having contributed lyrics to bands like Hawkwind, and even fronting his own band, Michael Moorcock and the Deep Fix.
Anyway, getting back on track, Eric Bloom, who's a huge nerd in his own right by the way, wrote a fan letter to Moorcock saying what a huge fan he was of his work. Moorcock wrote back saying he was actually a big fan of Blue Oyster Cult, and this led to the pair collaborating on different songs, starting with the Great Sun Jester on this album.
While still falling victim to an overly polished production to give it that pop sound, the lyrics and heart are where this number really shines. The song was apparently written in tribute to a mutual friend who had passed away, albeit with a sci-fi fantasy bend to make it interesting, and you can tell that a lot of passion went into this one.
Still, 3 good songs do not a great album make. In fact, you could say the problems with Mirrors are best exemplified by the cover art.
Although this looks like a photograph, it's actually a photorealistic painting. Now sure, photorealistic paintings take a lot of effort to make, but here it's kind of a shame that said effort was put into making a rather bland, forgettable image, and then they just slapped the BOC logo on the bottom almost as an afterthought, rather than incorporating it into the image creatively as past covers had done. Lots of effort to make something generic that's trying to be something it's not. In a way, it's a perfect cover for this album, and that's not a good thing.
Mirrors cracked, and the shards cut the band badly. The album didn't sell, and now faced with 7 years of bad luck, it was time for the band to go back to basics. There are only a handful of albums which I can listen to from start to finish without feeling the need to push the skip button. 1980's Cultösaurus erectus is one of those albums.
Following the failure of Mirrors, Blue Oyster Cult decided to go back to their roots, and the result was this literal monster of an album.
If you're wondering where the choice of dinosaur imagery comes from, you could call it somewhat of an inside joke.
By 1980, BOC's brand of heavy metal was said to be going extinct, all to be replaced by punk and new wave. By giving their album the image and name of a prehistoric nightmare, the cover by the way is Behemoth Swirl by Richard Clifton Day, the Oyster Boys were making a declaration that they were metal, they wouldn't change, and they weren't going anywhere. This mindset went into recording as well, and the result is an absolutely fantastic album.
Although Agents of Fortune, Spectres, and the next album on our list might be the most popular Blue Oyster Cult albums, I would say Cultösaurus erectus is the most underrated.
From its opening notes, it just never lets up. It opens with the second Bloom-Moorcock collaboration, Black Blade, which is based on Elric and Stormbringer, and just might be one of the best songs to tackle this dark fantasy duo. That's the most popular song on the album, yes, but there isn't a single dud to be found here. Whether it's the musical and narrative complexities of Monsters, the intentionally disturbing energy of Hungry Boys, the eerie atmosphere of Unknown Tongue, or the blood-pumping power of Fallen Angel, it's just a great album through and through, and you should be listening to it right now. Well, I mean after you finish watching this video, but still.
Cultösaurus erectus wasn't a runaway hit, but it did better than Mirrors, and more importantly, it got the band back on track. Between that and a successful Black and Blue tour opposite of Black Sabbath, the band was now in a perfect position for their next big hit.
The year was 1981, and a new television channel called MTV was changing the music landscape by broadcasting live concerts, getting exclusive interviews with artists and bigwigs, and introducing the world to a strange new idea called the music video. It was a revolution the likes of which popular music had never seen before. At the same time, an animated film based on Heavy Metal magazine had been released, with a soundtrack that featured multiple contributions from various rock and metal bands, including Blue Oyster Cult. Despite mixed reviews, it had an underground following that would influence a lot of creative minds in the decades to come.
Did all of these factors play a part in the unexpected success of the band's 8th album, Fire of Unknown Origin? Probably, but even without that, this is still a great album. As great as Cultösaurus erectus? Well, I personally don't think so, but the presence of a few forgettable songs doesn't detract from this being one killer album to listen to.
Obviously, you all know the lead single Burnin' For You, and it deserves to be considered a classic. It's composed and played expertly, but it should not detract from the other great songs on display here. In reference to their involvement with the heavy metal film, Fire features an entire song based on the final segment entitled Vengeance the Pact, which stands quite well on its own whether you've seen the movie or not. Furthermore, the title track serves as an example of the proper way to combine BOC's hard rock style with the synth-driven sound of new wave, and the post-apocalyptic Soul Survivor makes for a fascinating narrative piece.
For me, though, the standout track is Veteran of the Psychic Wars, the last of the Eric Bloom-Michael Moorcock collaborations.
Everything about this song is perfect. The drums and bass pound out a powerful marching beat, the guitars echo in a haunting melody, the keyboards add loads of atmosphere, and the lyrics sung by Eric convey the story of a world-weary soldier who wants to stop fighting, yet can't. It is my personal favorite from the album, and one of my favorite songs, period.
But I did imply the presence of duds earlier. The final track, Don't Turn Your Back, is fairly forgettable, but I would say the low point is Joan Crawford.
Now again, this song likely played a part in the album's unexpected success. 1981 also saw the release of Mommy Dearest, a dramatization of then recently deceased actress Joan Crawford's life according to her adopted daughter Christina. The twist being that, according to Christina, Crawford was an abusive psychopath who took every opportunity to mistreat her children.
What does any of that have to do with the song? Heck if I know. Half the fun of being a Blue Oyster Cult fan is debating what the lyrics are about, but I've listened to this song over and over again, and I can't make heads or tails of it.
The chorus is about Joan Crawford rising from the dead to haunt Christina again, but the rest of the song is describing the kind of random imagery you would expect from a Weird Al Yankovic original. There's no logic or connectivity to the lyrics at all, and as if that weren't bad enough, the song decides to use a random assortment of sound effects in place of a guitar solo. Aside from the association with the film and the controversy attached to the music video, I can't say this song really had anything else going for it.
But why let a few clunkers get in the way of greatness? Fire of Unknown Origin was the next big success for Blue Oyster Cult, and they were ready to once again become stars in the MTV age. And then a problem arose.
During the tours for Fire, Albert Bouchard started showing up late for shows. And by late, I mean not getting to the venue until the show was nearly over every single night. The closest thing we ever got to an explanation was that he was doing some, quote, soul-searching, unquote, and he would get over it soon. For the rest of the band, soon wasn't coming soon enough, and Albert was unceremoniously dropped from the roster and replaced with the guy who had to fill in for him during the live shows. That man was Rick Downey, a stage technician who also happened to be a drummer. The live album Extraterrestrial Live was released to introduce him to the public, and for the next studio album, he would take full drumming responsibilities.
Let's see how that went, shall we? Time marches on, but history repeats itself. Blue Oyster Cult had unexpectedly struck gold yet again, and yet again, they followed it up with something that had a more contemporary sound. The resulting album was The Revolution by Night, the first album to be made without Albert Bouchard on the drums. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, and indeed it didn't do as well as Fire. But then again, there is a reason this album is considered the end of the band's classic period.
Unlike Mirrors, which was a blatant case of selling out, Revolution does a much better job of incorporating new wave elements into its sound. There are heavier keyboards and use of electric drums, but these exist as part of the hard rock stylings rather than in opposition to them. The result is something that still sounds like Blue Oyster Cult, even with the noticeable absence of a founding member.
Then again, I don't want to come across as a purist who opposes the inclusion of Rick Downey on principle.
Rick isn't necessarily a better drummer than Albert, but he definitely holds his own by having a different style. As such, he deserves credit for the work he did here. Seriously, he pounds out the rhythm so fast on some songs that I'm surprised he didn't explode like a Spinal Tap percussionist. That being said, the dynamic is noticeably different on this album, and perhaps that was part of why it didn't do quite as well as hoped for.
Still, there's a lot to like here.
Take Me Away is the obvious standout with its extraterrestrial themes and guitar contributions from co-writer Aldo Nova, and Shooting Shark is a nice throwback to the band's early collaborations with Patti Smith. But one should not miss out on the paranoid narrative of Veins, the heavy stylings of Feel the Thunder, or the energy of Dragon Lady. As far as weak numbers, that honor goes to Light Years of Love, which just feels a bit too synth-poppy for the band, but it comes at the end, so it's easy to avoid.
The Revolution by Night may not be the band's best effort, but it still deserves to be counted among the classic albums. Unfortunately, after this, things were about to nosedive hard. Oh, Club Ninja. You tried.
The big issue with Club Ninja is similar to the big issue with Mirrors. It tried leaning hard into that modern sound instead of playing to the band's strengths, and the result was something that can only be described as generic. The music isn't necessarily bad for 80s rock, but once again, it doesn't feel right for Blue Oyster Cult. Part of the problem can no doubt be linked to another drastic shift in the band's lineup. First, they replaced Rick Downey with Johnny Wilcox for some reason. Then Alan Lehner stepped away because he didn't like the direction things were going in, and he was replaced with Tommy Zvanchek? I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
With only 3 original members remaining, a lot of that classic dynamic that made Blue Oyster Cult albums work in the past is absent, meaning the whole album winds up feeling kinda bland. It just goes to show you that Blue Oyster Cult really was a band, functioning best as a unified group, and altering that group led to problems with the sound.
Granted, Club Ninja still has some good stuff on it. You've got Perfect Water, and When the War Comes Home, and actually that's it. The rest is either filler or better suited to a different band. Dancin' in the Ruins is especially weak because it wants to be a thematic successor to Don't Fear the Reaper, but completely misses all of the stuff that made Don't Fear the Reaper work. What more is there to say about Club Ninja, really? It's hardly got anything to it, so there's not much left to discuss. Its failure would lead to the departure of Joe from the band, leaving only Eric and Buck as the gatekeepers of a legacy that was slowly falling apart.
Club Ninja may have failed, but that was entirely due to mistakes made in an attempt to stay relevant. The next album, though, that's where things get frustrating. The behind-the-scenes story of Imaginos could probably fill a feature-length documentary, assuming anyone could actually make sense of what happened. The tale behind this album is so complicated and involves so many different players that to this day there's still debate over who contributed what and how much of it to the finished album.
Here's the closest I can come to summarizing events. After being booted from BOC, Albert Bouchard decided that without the others around to nix him, he could finally do the one thing he'd always wanted to and adapt Sandy Pearlman's soft doctrines of Imaginos into a proper rock opera. He finished composing songs with Sandy, pitched the idea to the studio, and invited a whole bunch of guest musicians, including Alan and Joe, to contribute to what was intended as a trilogy of double-length albums. However, by 1984, the production ran out of money, and the only way Albert and Sandy could get the studio to give it another chance was to pitch it again as a Blue Oyster Cult album, which meant bringing in Eric and Buck for some massive re-recordings of the finished music.
At first, that may not sound like a bad idea. You could call it a dream come true. The band was finally back together. Maybe not in their traditional roles, but still, they were all back together once again for what could have been the biggest album of their entire careers.
However, it was made clear that Eric and Buck were only there out of respect for Sandy, rather than because they actually wanted to participate. Then things took a turn for the worse when the studio suddenly took a hatchet to the finished album, chopping it from double length to standard length, leaving only a handful of songs to release. Then, just to rub salt in the wound, the remaining songs were arranged out of order, rendering the concept of this concept album nigh incomprehensible. And then, the studio went about promoting the album as little as possible, producing only one music video that barely makes sense even if you do know the story, and which only appeared a couple of times on TV. The result is that the album bombed, thus giving the studio an excuse to kick Blue Oyster Cult to the curb. Not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but why on earth would any studio butcher an album this badly unless they wanted it to fail? This must have been a Springtime for Hitler ploy of some sort.
It really is a shame that things played out the way they did, because what remains of the mangled corpse of Imaginos is incredible. 9 tracks on this thing and not a single dud among them. It's like a more metallic take on the Wagnerian rock popularized by Jim Stein and Meatloaf, and it's as bombastic as you could possibly want a rock opera to be.
I suppose if I should single out any songs for discussion, it should be the 2 that originally showed up on Secret Treaties, those being Astronomy and Subhuman, the latter of which was retitled Blue Oyster Cult for the new release. Now, part of what makes the original Astronomy work is the atmosphere, achieved through tempo changes, heavy use of keyboards, and mixing it to make full use of stereo sound. The Imaginos version goes for a different kind of atmosphere, one that's less haunting but fitting for the rest of the album. It's almost the exact antithesis of the original song, as it maintains a steady beat, is guitar-driven, and does nothing especially cool with the mix, but I still find that it sounds good in its own right.
As for the Blue Oyster Cult song, it is a vast improvement over Subhuman, what with its expanded music and lyrical content.
The hook for this version is a genuine earworm, and even though it's over 7 minutes long, it doesn't overstay its welcome. And those are just the 2 familiar songs. The new content, such as Lace Invisibles, In the Presence of Another World, and The Siege and Investiture of Baron von Frankenstein's Castle at Wissaria, are equal in scope to those tracks.
Part of the reason why I like concept albums so much is that they never have any filler. Every song is there for a reason because every song is meant to move the plot forward. And even knowing that this album is incomplete and out of order, the strength of each track still shines through.
Imaginos may only be a Blue Oyster Cult album by way of a technicality, and it's definitely a victim of circumstance, but darn if it isn't some of the best rock and roll you'll ever hear. So don't think twice, just get it.
Following this, Alan Lehner rejoined the band, which also brought on John Rogers for the bass and Chuck Berge for the drums. They went on permanent touring status until 1992, which brings us to one of the stranger entries in their discography. One that brings us into the realm of cinema, after a fashion.
Once upon a time, Full Moon Entertainment, founded by Charles Band, was one of the most prolific producers of direct-to-video sci-fi and horror in the 80s and 90s. Their flagship title is the extensive Puppet Master series, but they also were known for such works as Shadow Zone, Zarkor the Invader, the Subspecies films, and I Can't Believe It's Not Doctor Strange. In 1992, the studio produced Bad Channels, a strange little sci-fi comedy that, yes, I will review one day.
Rock and roll is central to the plot of Bad Channels, so it only made sense to pull a Flash Gordon and get a rock band to compose the score, one that was well known but inexpensive. Well, in 1992, the label-less Blue Oyster Cult was the best of the cheapest, so they took the job. And yes, it was released on CD. In fact, it's one of the few Full Moon scores to actually get a CD release.
Now, there are a few other bands featured on the soundtrack, best summarized as The Last Two Strands of Hair Metal, The Poor Man's Nirvana, and The Unholy Union of Alice Cooper and Pee-wee's Playhouse, but we'll discuss them when I review the movie proper.
This video is about Blue Oyster Cult, so we'll keep our focus on them for the time being.
The Bad Channel's soundtrack opens with two new original songs, Demon's Kiss and The Horsemen Arrive, although neither of these are featured in the film itself for some reason. Musically, they're solid hard rock ventures that deliver exactly what you would want from the genre. Lyrically, Demon's Kiss feels like a callback to Tattoo Vampire from Agents of Fortune, though it is distinct enough to not feel like a retread. While The Horsemen Arrive is one of the few songs where the Oyster Boys skirt the line of making socio-political commentary, but not in an annoying way. The rest is the actual score, and it is indeed a score. This is basically ambient music, devoid of vocals and intended to create atmosphere in particular scenes.
It's good music, but it's not really for headbangers. This isn't so much rock and roll as it is dark ambient, and whether or not you like it would depend on whether or not you like the movie. But we can talk about the movie another day. Right now, we've got two more albums to discuss before we're through.
Okay, prior to 1998, the new lineup of BOC released an album called Cult Classics, which was basically a greatest hits album where all of the band's most popular songs were re-recorded for a new compilation. Since it's all older material done with two new members on the roster, it's not really worth talking about when we've already gone through the whole discography. It's only worth noting because it did well enough to convince Millbrook Studios to pick the band up for an album of brand new material.
That album was Heaven Forbid, and it's okay. There's plenty of good stuff to like here, partly thanks to lyrical contributions from sci-fi and horror author John Shirley.
The standout tracks for me would be the Southern Gothic-tinged Harvest Moon, the paranoid firearm ballad Hammerback, and the classic sci-fi inspired X-Ray Eyes. Yet despite being a mostly solid album, you can't help but feel as you listen to it that something's missing.
If you ask me, there are two important elements missing, and they're both named Bouchard.
It may sound cliche, but Blue Oyster Cult never really functioned the same way after that initial breakup. BOC really was a band, a unit without a single leader, and when the dynamic of that band is altered, you can really feel it. Heaven Forbid is not a bad album, and not even a bad Blue Oyster Cult album, but you can tell that the band just isn't what it used to be as you listen to it.
Then again, maybe part of the issue is that this album is semi-transitionary. Rogers and Berge only did some of the bass and drums here. The rest was done by Danny Miranda and Bobby Randinelli, respectively, and they would stick around for the next and final album on our list. And so we come to the end of our journey with Curse of the Hidden Mirror. Is it good? Well, yeah, it's good, but as I've been saying a lot by now, the fact that only 3/5 of the original band are present really does affect how this sounds.
Even so, I don't want to end this on a completely negative note, so it should be said that there are some great songs on this album. I defy anyone to tell me that The Old God's Return is anything but a classic, one of the best apocalyptic semi-Lovecraftian songs ever penned by any band. Put that alongside Stone of Love and Eye of the Hurricane, and you've got some darn good listening.
Unfortunately, this album did not do very well at all. It didn't sell, the band was dropped from the label, and that was pretty much the end of the story.
That's not to say the band has been completely silent since 2001. They've continued touring more or less consistently since then, even without a label, and recently there's been buzz that a new album will materialize at some point. You can bet I'll be doing a follow-up once it appears, if it ever does.
Unfortunately, there's pretty much no hope of getting the original band back together. The Bouchard brothers are pretty much done with music by this point, despite Albert trying to form several other bands after the Imaginos fiasco, and he did make a few attempts to rejoin the band on tour, though Eric and Buck did not like having him there. Even if the Bouchards were open to rejoining the band, though, one member has permanently left the stage.
Alan Lehner lost his battle with COPD in 2012, once again leaving only Eric Bloom and Buck Dharma as the vanguards of the legacy.
And what a legacy it is! Even if things did peter out towards the end, Blue Oyster Cult had one heck of a run for what many people consider an obscure band.
They were influential in ways most people don't even realize, and they had far more material than the 3 admittedly great songs everyone knows, which shall no doubt grace the radio airwaves for eternity. Like the Spectre of Imaginos, they had an impact while remaining in the shadows, only occasionally entering the spotlight to remind the world that there was more to music than love songs and substance abuse.
To put a spin on one of my catchphrases, Blue Oyster Cult is one of the best bands you may not have heard of. Hopefully this video has piqued your curiosity if you haven't listened to them before, and if you do listen to them, maybe, just maybe, they'll expand your definitions of what rock and roll is capable of. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, signing off. You know, if they ever made a biopic film for Blue Oyster Cult like they did for Queen and Elton John, maybe I could play Eric Bloom. I do kinda have the look down.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.